Good morning. Just a week ago, the whole world watched what happened when Chris Rock made a joke about Will Smith's wife. And Will Smith went up onto the stage and hit Chris Rock and then sat back down in his seat and began to curse profanities at him. And God came to Will Smith this week and said, Will, you will not be able to go into the promised land. You will not be able to go to the land of Israel because you hit the rock rather than speak to the rock. How beautiful would it have been if after Chris Rock made that joke, if Will Smith would have gone up and said, Chris, you just embarrassed my wife in public. Let me tell you how much pain my wife has gone through over the past 4 years. Let me tell you how many times I've seen my wife cry, having lost patches of hair to this illness. Please apologize to my wife. And if Chris Rock would have apologized, and then Will Smith and Chris Rock would have embraced, and then everyone would have given them a standing ovation, that would have been a wonderful moment, a moment of learning how to use speech properly. Yesterday's Torah portion and this week's coming Torah portion are two Torah portions devoted to the same subject, proper speech. The word for an affliction of tsaras, which is a form of leprosy that would afflict somebody who spoke negatively, was a lesion on the skin. And the word for that is nega, nun gimel ayin. But if you take the last letter of nega, a plague, like from the word negative, and you put the ayin in the beginning of the word nega, you rearrange the word to spell oneg, which means pleasure, delight. And our rabbis say, depending what we look at, what we focus on in life, what we notice, what we see, we could either experience nega, an affliction, or oneg, pleasure and delight. And therefore the world saw last week the power of speech, how hurtful and harmful it can be. And therefore we have to think twice before we speak and make sure that everything we say is kind, loving, generous, and words that bring people closer together and not push them further away. Last week, the oldest immigrant, the oldest refugee from Ukraine arrived in Israel. Her name is Duba Gobretsky. And Duba arrived from Ukraine after being rescued by Magen David Adom and Zaka. It took 11 hours to get her from her apartment in Kiev to Moldova, where she was put on an El Al flight and brought to the land of Israel at the age of 100 years old and 5 months. She was born and raised her whole life in Kiev, and she was a Holocaust survivor. And when she landed in Ben Gurion, the Prime Minister of Israel, Naftali Bennett, was there to greet her. And she had a Russian translator because she doesn't speak Hebrew. And she was warmly greeted and welcomed to the land of Israel at the age of 100 years old. And then the Prime Minister said to her, Duba, do you know any Hebrew words? And she said, yes, 2 words, Shalom Yisrael, peace unto Israel. And then she turned to her Russian translator and said, how do you say spasiba, how do you say thank you in Hebrew? And her Russian translator said, Todah. And then she looked at the Prime Minister and said, Todah Yisrael, thank you Israel for rescuing me at the age of 100 years old. And here's a woman who's 100 years old and 5 months, arrives in a new country having survived the Holocaust, been born in 1922 and raised her whole life in Kiev, and she's starting her life all over again, learning a new language. And the first 3 words she learns are Shalom, Yisrael, and Todah. And the first 2 sentences she forms is Shalom, Yisrael, peace, O Israel. Todah, Yisrael, thank you, Israel. If she could learn a new language and a new vocabulary of love and kindness at 100 years old, surely all of us are still young enough to learn how to speak only a language of love and positivity. Have a wonderful day.